welcome back to another video. I am so sorry that it has taken me so long to get this next part out to you. I actually did try to live stream it, but halfway through YouTube took it down and stopped the stream, so that's fine. Just kind of a quick update. Life has been crazy, which is why it's taken me forever to get this over to you guys, but part of that is because I got a puppy and you can hear him walking around, and you may hear his collar, the tags on his collar clink together. It's about 9 o'clock at night right now, so he is pretty tired. He may get up though and go outside and come back in. So if you hear that, that is what's up. Also, there's a fan running in the background. That'll be pretty consistent. The AC is actually really quiet. I just moved, so no more loud AC, no more loud children running around outside, just me and the puppy, who will be making his debut on the channel sometime very soon. We're going to do a little day in the life with him and the ASMR sounds he makes. So anyway, without further ado, let's get started on part 5. This is our part 5. Well, this is actually the book's part 3 and our part 5. And this is in my book starting on page 95. Chicago was a break in my journey, a resumption of my name, identity, and happy marital status. My wife flew in from the east for her brief visit. I was delighted at the change, back to my known and trusted life. But here I run into a literary difficulty. Chicago broke my continuity. This is permissible in life, but not in writing. So I leave Chicago out because it is off the line and out of drawing. In my travels, it was pleasant and good. In writing, it would contribute only a disunity. When that time was over and the goodbyes said, I had to go through the same loss, loneliness all over again, and it was no less painful than at first. There seemed to be no cure for loneliness, save only for being lonely. Charley was torn 3 ways, with anger at me for leaving him, with gladness at the sight of Rocinante, and with pure pride in his appearance. For when Charley is groomed and clipped and washed, he is as pleased with himself as is a man with a good tailor, or a woman newly patented by a beauty parlor, all of whom can believe they are like that clear through. Charley's combed columns of legs were noble things. His cap of silver blue fur was rakish, and he carried the pompon of his tail like the baton of a bandmaster. A wealth of combed and clipped mustache gave him the appearance and attitude of a French rake of the 19th century, and incidentally concealed his crooked front teeth. I happen to know what he looks like without the tailoring. One summer, when his fur grew matted and mildewed, I clipped him to the skin. Under those sturdy towers of legs are spindly shanks, thin and not too straight. With his chest rough removed, one can see the sagging stomach of the middle-aged. But if Charley was aware of his deep-down inadequacy, he gave no sign. If manners maketh man, then manner and grooming maketh poodle. He sat straight and nobly in the seat of Rocinante, and he gave me to understand that while forgiveness was not impossible, I would have to work for it. He is a fraud, and I know it. Once when our boys were little and in summer camp, we paid them the deadly parents' visit. When we were about to depart, a lady parent told us she had to leave quickly to keep her child from going into hysterics. And with brave but trembling lips, she fled blindly, masking her feeling to save her child. The boy watched her go, and then with infinite relief went back to his gang and his business, knowing that he too had played the game. And I know for a fact that 5 minutes after I had left Charley, he had found new friends, and had made his arrangements for his comfort. But one thing Charley did not fake. He was delighted to be traveling again, and for a few days he was an ornament to the trip. Illinois did a far autumn day for us, crisp and clean. We moved quickly northward, heading for Wisconsin through a noble land of good fields and magnificent trees. A gentleman's countryside, neat and white-faced, and I would guess subsidized by outside income. It did not seem to me to have the thrust of land that supports itself and its owner. Rather, it was like a beautiful woman who requires the support and help of many faceless ones just to keep going. but this fact does not make her less lovely if you can afford her. It is possible, even probable, to be told the truth about a place and to accept it, to know it and at the same time not know anything about it. I had never been to Wisconsin, but all my life I had heard about it and eaten its cheeses, some of them as good as any in the world. And I must have seen pictures. Everyone must have. Why then was I unprepared for the beauty of this region, for its variety of field and hill, forest, lake? I think now I must have considered it one big level cow pasture because of the state's enormous yield of milk products. I never saw a country that changed so rapidly, and because I had not expected it, everything I saw brought a delight. I don't know how it is in other seasons. The summers may reek and rock with heat, the winters may groan with dismal cold, but when I saw it for the first and only time in early October, the air was rich with butter-colored sunlight, not fuzzy but crisp and clear, so that every frost-gay tree was set off. The rising hills were not compounded, but alone and separate. There was a penetration of the light into solid substance so that I seemed to see into things, deep in, and I have seen that kind of light elsewhere only in Greece. I remember now that I had been told that Wisconsin is a lovely state, but the telling had not prepared me. It was a magic day. The land dripped with richness, the fat cows and pigs gleaming against green, and in the smaller holdings, corn standing in little tents as corn should, and pumpkins all about. I don't know whether or not Wisconsin has a cheese tasting festival, but I am a lover of cheese and believe it should. Cheese was everywhere. Cheese centers, cheese cooperatives, cheese stores and stands, perhaps even cheese ice cream. I can believe anything, since I saw a score of signs advertising Swiss cheese candy. It is sad that I didn't stop to sample Swiss cheese candy. Now I can't persuade anyone else that it exists, and that I did not make it up. Beside the road I saw a very large establishment, the greatest distributor of seashells in the world, and this is in Wisconsin, which hasn't known a sea since Precambrian times. But Wisconsin is loaded with surprises. I had heard of the Wisconsin Dells, but was not prepared for the weird country sculptured by the Ice Age, a strange, gleaming country of water and carved rock, black and green. To awaken here might make one believe in it a dream of some other planet, for it has non-earthly quality, or else the engraved record of a time when the world was much younger and much different. Clinging to the sides of the dreamlike waterways was the litter of our times, the motels, the hot dog stands, the merchants of the cheap and mediocre and tawdry, so loved by summer tourists. But these incrustations were closed and boarded against the winter, and, even open, I doubt that they could dispel the enchantment of the Wisconsin Dells. I stopped that night on a hilltop that was a trucker's place, but of a special kind. Here the gigantic cattle trucks rested and scraped out the residue left by their recent cargoes. There were mountains of manure, and over them mushroom clouds of flies. Charley moved about, smiling and sniffing ecstatically like an American woman in a French perfume shop. I can't bring myself to criticize his taste. Some people like one thing and some another. The odors were rich and earthly, but not disgusting. As the evening deepened, I walked with Charley among his mountains of delight to the brow of the hill and looked down on the little valley below. It was a disturbing sight. I thought too much driving had distorted my vision or addled my judgment, for the dark earth below seemed to move and pulse and breathe. It was not water, but it rippled like a black liquid. I walked quickly down the hill to iron out the distortion. The valley floor was carpeted with turkeys. It seemed like millions of them, so densely packed that they covered the earth. It was a great relief. Of course, this was a reservoir for Thanksgiving. To mill so close together is in the nature of the turkeys in the evening. I remembered how on the ranch in my youth the turkeys gathered and roosted in clots in the cypress trees, out of reach of wildcats and coyotes, the only indication I know of that turkeys have any intelligence at all. To know them is not to admire them, for they are vain and hysterical. They gather in vulnerable groups and then panic at rumors. They are subject to all the sicknesses of other fowl, together with some of them they have invented. Turkeys seem to be manic depressive types, gobbling with blushing wattles, spread tails, and scraping wings in amorous bravado at one moment, and huddled in craven cowardice the next. It is hard to see how they can be related to their wild, clever, suspicious cousins. But here in their thousands, they carpeted the earth waiting to lie on their backs on the platters of America. I know it is a shame that I had never seen the noble twin cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis, but how much greater a disgrace that I still haven't, although I went through them. As I approached, a great surf of traffic engulfed me, waves of station wagons, riptides of roaring trucks. I wondered why it is that when I plan a route too carefully it goes to pieces, whereas if I blunder along in blissful ignorance aimed in a fancy direction, I get through with no trouble. In the early morning, I had studied maps, drawn a careful line across the way I wished to go. I still have that arrogant plan, into St. Paul on Highway 10, then gently across the Mississippi. The S-curve in the Mississippi here would give me 3 crossings of the river. After this pleasant jaunt, I meant to go through the Golden Valley, drawn by its name. That seemed simple enough, and perhaps it can be done, but not by me. First, the traffic struck me like a tidal wave and carried me along, a bit of a shiny flotsam bounded in front by a gasoline truck half a block long. Behind me was an enormous cement mixer on wheels, its big howitzer revolving as it proceeded. On my right was what I judged to be an atomic cannon. As usual, I panicked and got lost. Like a weakening swimmer, I edged to the right into a pleasant street, only to be stopped by a policeman, who informed me that trucks and such vermin were not permitted there. He thrust me back into the ravening stream. I drove for hours, never able to take my eyes from the surrounding mammoths. I must have crossed the river, but I couldn't see it. I never did see it. I never saw St. Paul or Minneapolis. All I saw was a river of trucks. All I heard was a roar of motors. The air saturated with diesel fumes burned in my lungs. Charley got a coughing fit, and I couldn't take time to pat him on the back. At a red light, I saw that I was on an evacuation route. It took some time for that to penetrate. My head was spinning. I had lost all sense of direction, but the signs, evacuation route, continued. Of course, it is the planned escape route for the bomb that hasn't been dropped. Here in the middle of the Midwest was an escape route, a road designed by fear. In my mind, I could see it because I've seen people running away, the roads clogged to a standstill, and the stampede over the cliff of our own designing. And suddenly I thought of that valley of the turkeys and wondered how I could have the gall to think turkeys stupid. Indeed, they have an advantage over us. They're good to eat. It took me nearly 4 hours to get through the Twin Cities. I've heard that some parts of them are beautiful, and I never found Golden Valley. Charley was no help. He wasn't involved with a race that could build a thing it had to escape from. He didn't want to go to the moon just to get the hell away from it all. Confronted with our stupidities, Charley accepts them for what they are, stupidities. Sometime in these bedlam hours, I must have crossed the river again because I had got back on US 60 and was moving north on the east side of the Mississippi. The country opened out and I stopped at a roadside restaurant, exhausted. It was a German restaurant complete with sausages, sauerkraut, and beer steins hanging in rows over the bar, shining but unused. I was the only customer that time of day. The waitress was no Brunhild, but a lean, dark-faced little thing, either a young and troubled girl or a very spry old woman. I couldn't tell which. I ordered bratwurst and sauerkraut, and distinctly saw the cook unwrap a sausage from a cellophane slipcover and drop it in boiling water. The beer came in a can. The bratwurst was terrible, and the kraut an insulting, watery mess. "I wonder if you can help me?" I asked the young, ancient waitress. "What's your trouble?" "I guess I'm a little lost." "How do you mean lost?" she said. The cook leaned through his window and rested his bare elbows on the serving counter. "I want to go to Sauk Center, and I don't seem to be getting there." "Where'd you come from?" "Minneapolis." "Then what you doing this side of the river?" "Well, I seem to have got lost in Minneapolis, too." She looked at the cook. "He got lost in Minneapolis," she said. "Nobody can get lost in Minneapolis," the cook said. "I was born there, and I know." The waitress said, "I come from St. Cloud, and I can't get lost in Minneapolis." "I guess I brought some new talent to it, but I want to go to Sauk Center." The cook said, "If he can stay on a road, he can't get lost. You're on 52. Cross over at St. Cloud and stay on 52. "Is Sauk Center on 52? "Ain't no place else. You must be a stranger around here, getting lost in Minneapolis. I couldn't get lost blindfolded. I said a little snappishly. Could you get lost in Albany or San Francisco? I'd never been there, but I bet I wouldn't get lost. I've been to Duluth, the waitress said. And Christmas, I'm going to Sioux Falls. I got an aunt there. And you ain't got relatives in Sauk Center? The cook asked. Sure, but that's not so far away. Like he says, San Francisco. My brother's in the Navy. He's in San Diego. You got relations in Sauk Center? No, I just want to see it. Sinclair Lewis came from there. Oh, yeah, they got a sign up. I guess quite a few folk come to see it. It does the town some good. He's the first man who told me about this part of the country. Who is? Sinclair Lewis. Oh, yeah. You know him? No, I just read him. I'm sure she was going to say who, but I stopped her. You say I cross St. Cloud and stay on 52? The cook said, I don't think what's-his-name is there anymore. I know. He's dead. You don't say. There was a sign in Sauk Center, all right. Birthplace of Sinclair Lewis. For some reason, I went through there fast and turned north on 71 to Wadena, and it got dark, and I pounded on to Detroit Lakes. There was a face before me, a lean and shriveled face like an apple too long in the burrow, a lonely face and sick with loneliness. I didn't know him well, never knew him in the boisterous days when he was called Red. Toward the end of his life, he called me several times in New York, and we would have lunch at the Algonquin. I called him Mr. Lewis, still do in my mind. He didn't drink any more and took no pleasure in his food, but now and then his eyes would glitter with steel. I had read Main Street when I was in high school, and I remember the violent hatred it aroused in the countryside of his nativity. Did he go back? Just went through now and again. The only good writer was a dead writer. Then he couldn't surprise anyone anymore, couldn't hurt anyone anymore. And the last time I saw him, he seemed to have shriveled even more. He said, I'm cold. I seem to always be cold. I'm going to Italy. And he did, and he died there. And I don't know whether or not it's true, but I heard he died alone. And now he's good for the town. Brings in some tourists. He's a good writer now. If there had been room in Rocinante, I would have packed the WPA guides to the States, all 48 volumes of them. I have them all, and some are very rare. If I remember correctly, North Dakota printed only 800 copies, and South Dakota about 500. The complete set compromises the most comprehensive account of the United States ever got together, and nothing since has even approached it. It was compiled during the Depressions by the best writers in America, who were, if that is possible, more depressed than any other group, while maintaining their inalienable instinct for eating. But these books were tested by Mr. Roosevelt's opposition. If WPA workers leaned on their shovels, the writers leaned on their pens. The result was that in some states the plates were broken up after a few copies were printed, and that is a shame because they were reservoirs of organized, documented, and well-written information, geological, historical, and economic. If I had carried my guides along, for example, I would have looked up Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, where I stopped, and would have known why it's called Detroit Lakes, who named it, when, and why. I stopped near there late at night, and so did Charley, and I don't know if any more about it than he does. The next day, a long-cultivated ambition was to blossom and fruit. Curious how a place unvisited can take such hold on the mind so that the very name sets up a ringing. To me, such a place was Fargo, North Dakota. Perhaps its first impact is in the name Wells Fargo, but my interest certainly goes beyond that. If you will take a map of the United States and fold it in the middle, eastern edge against western, and crease it sharply, right in the crease will be Fargo. On double-page maps, sometimes Fargo gets lost in the binding. That may not be a very scientific method for finding the east-west middle of the country, but it will do. But beyond this, Fargo to me is brother to the fabulous places of the earth, kin to those magically remote spots mentioned by Herodotus and Marco Polo and Mandeville. From my earliest memory, if it was a cold day, Fargo was the coldest place on the continent. If heat was the subject, then at the time the papers listed Fargo as hotter than any place else, or wetter, or drier, or deeper in snow. That's my impression anyway. But I know that 1,500 towns will rise up in injured wrath to denounce me with claims and figures for having much more dreadful weather than Fargo. I apologized to them in advance. As a sop to hurt feelings, I must admit that when I passed through Moorhead, Minnesota, and rattled across the Red River into Fargo on the other side, it was a golden autumn day, the town as traffic-troubled, as neon-plastered, as cluttered and milling with activity as any other up-and-coming town of 46,000 souls. The countryside was no different from Minnesota over the river. I drove through the town as usual, seeing little but the truck ahead of me and the Thunderbird in my rearview mirror. It's bad to have one's myth shaken up like that. Would a Samarkand or Cathay or Cipango have suffered the same fate if visited? As soon as I cleared the outskirts, the broken metal and glass outer ring, and moved through Mapleton, I found a pleasant place to stop on the Maple River, not far from Alice. What a wonderful name for a town, Alice. It had 162 inhabitants in 1950 and 124 at the last census. And so much for the population explosion at Alice. Anyway, on the Maple River, I drew into a little copse of sycamores, I think, that overhung the stream, and paused to lick my mythological wounds. And I found joy with the fact that Fargo had in no way disturbed my mind's picture of it. I could still think of Fargo as I always had. Blizzard-riven, heat-blasted, dust-rattled. I'm happy to report that in the war between reality and romance, reality is not the stronger. Although it was only mid-morning, I cooked a sumptuous dinner for myself, but I don't remember what it was. And Charley, who still had vestiges of his Chicago grooming, waded in the water and became his old dirty self again. After the comfort and the company of Chicago, I had had to learn to be alone again. It takes a little time, but there on the Maple River, not far from Alice, the gift of it was coming back. Charley had forgiven me in a nauseatingly superior way, but now he had settled down to business also. The pull-out place beside the water was pleasant. I brought out my garbage can, washing machine, and rinsed clothes that had been jiggling in detergent for 2 days. And then, because of a pleasant breeze blowing, I spread my sheets to dry on some low bushes. I don't know what kind of bushes they were, but the leaves had a rich smell like sandalwood, and there's nothing I like better than scented sheets. And I had made some notes on a sheet of yellow paper on the nature and quality of being alone. These notes would, in the normal course of events, have been lost as notes are always lost, but these particular notes turned up long afterward, wrapped around a bottle of ketchup and secured with a rubber band. The first note says, "Relationship time to aloneness," and I remember about that. Having a companion fixes you in time and that the present, but when the quality of aloneness settles down, past, present, and future all flow together. A memory, a present event, and a forecast all equally present. The second note lies obscurely under a streak of ketchup, or catsup, but the third is electric. It says, "Reversion to pleasure-pain basis," and this is from some observation of another time. A number of years ago, I had some experience with being alone. For 2 succeeding years, I was alone each winter for 8 months at a stretch in the Sierra Nevada mountains on Lake Tahoe. I was a caretaker on a summer estate during the winter months when it was snowed in, and I made some observations then. As the time went on, I found that my reactions thickened. Ordinarily, I'm a whistler. I stopped whistling. I stopped conversing with my dogs, and I believe that subtleties of feeling began to disappear until finally I was on a pleasure-pain basis. Then it occurred to me that the delicate shades of feeling, of reaction, are the result of communication, and without such communication they tend to disappear. A man with nothing to say has no words. Can its reverse be true? A man who has one to say anything to has no words, and as he has no need for words? Now and then, there are pure accounts of babies raised by animals, wolves and such. It's usually reported that the youngster crawls on all fours, makes those sounds learned from his foster parents, and perhaps even thinks like a wolf. Only through imitation do we develop toward originality. Take Charley, for example. He is always associated with the learned, the gentle, the literate, and the responsible, both in France and in America. And Charley is no more like a dog than he is like a cat. His perceptions are sharp and delicate, and he is a mind reader. I don't know that he can read the thoughts of other dogs, but he can read mine. Before a plane is half flown over my mind, Charley knows about it, and he also knows whether he is to be included in it. There's no question about this. I know too well his look of despair and disapproval when I've just thought that he must be left at home. and so much for 3 notes below the red stain on the ketchup bottle. Soon Charley moved downstream and found some discarded bags of garbage, which he went through with discrimination. He nosed over an empty bean can, sniffed in its opening, and rejected it. Then he took up the paper bag in his teeth and gently shook it so that more treasures rolled out, among them a balled-up piece of heavy white paper. I opened it and smoothed the angry creases from its surface. It was a court order addressed to Jack so-and-so, informing him that if he didn't pay back his alimony, he would be in contempt and punishable. The court sat in an eastern state, and this was North Dakota. Some poor guy on the lam. He shouldn't have left this spore around in case anyone was looking for him. I snapped my Zippo lighter and burned the evidence with full knowledge that I have compounded the contempt. Good Lord, the trails we leave. Suppose someone, finding the ketchup bottle, tried to reconstruct me from my notes. I helped Charley sort over the garbage, but there was no other written material, only the containers of prepared foods. The man was no cook. He lived out of cans, but then perhaps his former wife did also. It was only shortly after noon, but I was so relaxed and comfortable that I hated to move. Should we stay the night, Charley? He inspected me and wagged his tail as Professor wags pencil, once to the left, once to the right, and returned to center. I sat on the bank, took off socks and boots, and dipped my feet in water so cold it burned until the freezing went deep and deadened feeling. My mother believed that cold water on the feet forced blood to your head so that you thought better. Time for examination, mon vieux chamal, I said aloud, which is another way of saying I feel comfortably lazy. I came out on the trip to try and learn something of America. Am I learning anything? If I am, I don't know what it is. So far, can I go back with a bag full of conclusions, a cluster of answers to riddles? I doubt it, but maybe. When I go to tear up, when I'm asked what America is like, what will I say? I don't know. Well, using your olfactory method of investigation, what have you learned, my friend? 2 complete wags. At least he didn't leave the question open. Does all America so far smell alike, or are there sectional smells? Charley began to turn around and around to the left, and then he reversed and turned 8 times to the right before he finally settled and put his nose on his paws and his head within reach of my hand. He has a hard time getting down. When he was young, a car hit him and broke his hip. He wore a cast for a long time. Now in his golden age, his hip troubles him when he's tired. After too long a run, he limps on his right hind leg. But because of his long turning before lying down, we sometimes call him a whirlpoodle, much to our shame. If my mother's rule was right, I was thinking pretty well, but she also said, cold feet, warm heart, and that's a different matter. I had parked well away from the road and from any traffic for my time of rest and recount. I am serious about this. I did not put aside my sloth for the sake of a few amusing anecdotes. I came with the wish to learn what America is like, and I wasn't sure I was learning anything. I found I was talking aloud to Charley. He just likes the idea, but the practice makes him sleepy. Just for ducks, let's try a little of what my boys would call this generality jazz. Underheads and subheads. Let's take food as we have found it. It is more than possible that in the cities we have passed through, traffic here, there are good and distinguished restaurants with menus of delight. But in the eating places along the roads, the food has been clean, tasteless, colorless, and of complete sameness. It is almost as though the customers had no interest in what they ate as long as it had no character to embarrass them. This is true of all but the breakfasts, which are uniformly wonderful if you stick to bacon and eggs and pan-fried potatoes. At the roadsides, I never had a really good dinner or a really bad breakfast. The bacon or sausage was good and packaged at the factory, the eggs fresh or kept fresh by refrigeration, and refrigeration was universal. I might even say roadside America is the paradise of breakfast, except for one thing. Now and then, I would see a sign that said homemade sausage, or home smoked bacons and hams, or new laid eggs, and I would stop and lay in supplies. Then, cooking my own breakfast and making my own coffee, I found the difference was instantly apparent. A fresh laid egg does not taste remotely like the pale, battery-produced refrigerator egg. The sausage would be sweet and sharp and pungent with spices. My coffee was a wine-dark happiness. Can I then say that America I saw has put cleanliness first, at the expense of taste? And, since all our perceptive nerves, trunk including that of taste, are not only perfectible, but also capable of trauma, that the sense of taste tends to disappear, and that strong, pungent, or exotic flavors arouse suspicion and dislike and are so eliminated? Let's go a little farther into other fields, Charlie. Let's take the books, magazines, and papers we have seen displayed where we have stopped. The dominant publication has been comic books. There have been local papers, and I have bought and read them. There have been racks of paperbacks with some great and good titles, but overwhelmingly outnumbered by the volumes of sex, sadism, and homicide. The big city papers cast their shadows over large areas around them. The New York Times, as far as the Great Lakes. The Chicago Tribune, all the way here to North Dakota. Here, Charlie, I give you a warning. Should you be drawn to generalities? If this people has so atrophied its taste buds as to find tasteless food not only acceptable but desirable, what of the emotional life of the nation? Do they find their emotional affairs so bland it must be spiced with sex and sadism through the medium of the paperback? And if this is so, why are there no condiments save ketchup and mustard to enhance their foods? We've listened to local radio stations all across the country, and apart from a few reportings of football games, the mental fare has been generalized, packaged, and undistinguishable as the food. I stirred Charlie with my foot to keep him awake. I had been keen to hear what people thought politically. Those whom I met did not talk about the subject, didn't seem to want to talk about it. It seemed to me partly caution and partly a lack of interest, but strong opinions were just not stated. One storekeeper did admit to me that he had to do business with both sides and could not permit himself the luxury of an opinion. He was a grinning man in a little gray store, a crossroads place where I stopped for a box of dog biscuits and a can of pipe tobacco. This man, this store, might have been anywhere in the nation, but actually it was back in Minnesota. The man had a kind of gray, wistful twinkle in his eye, as though he remembered humor when it was not against the law, so that I dared go out on a limb. I said, "It looks then as though the natural contentiousness of people had died, but I don't believe that. It'll just take another channel. Can you think, sir, of what that channel may be? You mean where they will bust out? Where do they bust out?" I was not wrong. The twinkle was there, the precious, humorous twinkle. "Well, sir," he said, "we've got a murder now and then, or we can read about them. Then we've got the World Series. You can raise a wind any time over the Pirates or the Yankees, but I guess the best of all is we've got the Russians. Feelings pretty strong there?" "Oh, sure. Hardly a day goes by somebody doesn't take a belt at the Russians." For some reason, he was getting a little easier, even permitted himself a chuckle that could have turned to a throat clearing if he saw a bad reaction from me. I asked, "Anybody know any Russians around here?" And now he went all out and laughed. "Of course not. That's why they're valuable. Nobody can find fault with you if you take out after the Russians." "Because we're not doing business with them?" He picked up a cheese knife from the counter and carefully ran his thumb along the edge and laid the knife down. "Maybe that's it. By George, maybe that's it. We're not doing business." "You think then we might be using the Russians as an outlet for something else? For other things?" "I didn't think that at all, sir, but I bet I'm going to. Why, I remember when the people took everything out on Mr. Roosevelt. Andy Larson got red in the face about Roosevelt one time when his hens got the croup." "Yes, sir," he said with growing enthusiasm. "Those Russians got quite a load to carry. Man has a fight with his wife, he belts the Russians. Maybe everybody needs Russians. I'll bet even in Russia they need Russians. Maybe they call it Americans." He cut a sliver of cheese from a wheel and held it out to me on the knife blade. "You've given me something to think about in a sneaking kind of way." "I thought you gave it to me." "How?" "About business and opinions." "Well, maybe so. Know what I'm going to do? Next time Andy Larson's comes red in the face, I'm going to see if the Russians are bothering his hens. It was a great loss to Andy when Mr. Roosevelt died. Now, I don't say that an awful lot of people have this man's sense of humor. Maybe they don't, but maybe they do. Also in the privacy or in non-business areas." Charlie raised his head and roared a warning without bothering to get to his feet. When I heard the motor approaching and trying to get up, found my feet were long gone in sleep in the cold water. I couldn't feel them at all. While I rubbed and massaged them, they awakened to painful pins and needles. A vintage sedan pulling a short coupled trailer like a box turtle lumbered down from the road and took position on the water about 50 yards away. I felt annoyance at this invasion of my privacy, but Charlie was delighted. He moved on stiff legs with little delicate menacing steps to investigate the newcomer, and in the manner of dogs and people, did not look directly at the object of his interest. If I seemed to be ridiculing Charley, look you at what I was doing in the next half hour, and also what my neighbor was doing. Each of us went about our business with slow deliberateness, each being careful, very careful, not to stare at each other, and at the same time sneaking glances, appraising, evaluating. I saw a man, not young, not old, but with a jaunty, springy step. He was dressed in olive drab trousers and a leather jacket, and he wore a cowboy hat, but with a flat crown and the brim curled, and he held to a peak by the chin strap. He had a classic profile, and even in the distance I could see that he wore a beard tied to his sideburns, and so found his hair. My own beard is restricted to my chin. The air had grown quickly chill, and I don't know whether my head was cold or that I didn't want to remain uncovered in the presence of a stranger. At any rate, I put on my old gamble cap, made a pot of coffee, and sat on my back steps, glancing with great interest at everything except my neighbor, who swept out his trailer and threw out a dishpan of soapy water while pointedly unwatched me. Charley's interest was captured and held by various growlings and barkings that came from inside the trailer. There must be in everyone the sense of proper and civil timing, for I had just resolved to speak to my neighbor, in fact, had just stood up to move toward him, when he strolled toward me. He too had felt the period of waiting was over. He moved with a strange gait, reminiscent to me of something I couldn't place. There was a seedy grandeur about the man. In the time of chivalric myth, this would be the beggar who turns out to be a king's son. As he came near, I stood up from my iron-back stoop to greet him. He did not give me a sweeping bow, but I had the impression that he might have. Either that or a full regimental salute. "Good afternoon," he said. "I see you are of the profession." I guess my mouth fell open. It's been years since I have heard the term. "Well, no, I'm not." Now it was his turn to look puzzled. "Not? But, my dear chap, if you're not, how do you know the expression?" "I guess I've been on the fringes." "Ah, fringes, of course. Backstage, no doubt. Direction, stage manager?" "Flops," I said. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" "Delighted." He never let down. That's one nice thing about those of the profession. They rarely do. He folded himself on the divan seat behind my table with a grace I never achieved in all my traveling, and I set out 2 plastic mugs and 2 glasses, poured coffee, and set a bottle of whiskey within easy reach. It seemed to me a mist of tears came to his eyes, but it might be that they were in mine. "Flops," he said. "Who hasn't known them hasn't played. Shall I pour for you?" "Please do." No water." He cleared his palate with black coffee and then munched delicately on the whiskey while his eyes swept my abode. "Nice place you have here. Very nice. Tell me, please, what made you think I was in the theater?" He chuckled dryly. "Very simple, Watson. You know I've played that, both parts. Well, first I saw your poodle, and then I observed your beard. Then on approaching, I saw you wore a naval cap with the British Royal Arms. Was that what brought in Jerez?" "That might be, old chap. That certainly might be. I fall into such things hardly knowing that I'm doing it. Now, close up, I saw he was not young. His movements were pure youth, but that was about his skin texture, and the edges of his lips that was middle-aged or past it. And his eyes, large, warm brown irises set on whites that were turning yellow, corroborated this. "Your health," I said. We emptied our plastic glasses, chased with coffee, and I refilled. "If it isn't too personal, or too painful, what did you do in the theater?" "I wrote a couple of plays." "Produced?" "Yes, they flopped." "Would I know your name?" "I doubt it. Nobody else did." He sighed. "It's a hard business, but if you're hooked, you're hooked. I was hooked by my granddaddy, and my daddy set the hook." "Both actors?" "And my mother and grandmother." "Lord, that is show business. Are you," I searched for the old word, "resting now?" "Not at all. I'm playing." "What, for God's sake, and where?" "Wherever I can trap an audience. Schools, churches, service clubs. I bring culture, give ratings. I guess you can hear my partner over there complaining. He's very good too. Part Airedale and part Coyote. Steals the show when he feels like it." I began to feel delighted with this man. I didn't know such things went on. They don't, some of the time. Been at it long? 3 years, less than 2 months. All over the country? Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together. I hadn't worked for over a year, just tramped the agencies and casting calls and lived up my benefits. With me, there's no question of doing something else. It's all I know, all I've ever known. Once long ago, there was a community of theater people on Nantucket Island. My daddy bought a nice lot there and put up a frame house. Well, I sold that and bought my outfit there, and I've been moving ever since, and I like it. I don't think I'll ever go back to the grind. Of course, if there should be a part, but hell, who'd remember me for a part? Any part. You're striking close to home there. Yeah, it's a hard business. I hope you won't think I'm inquisitive, even if I am. I'd like to know how you go about it. What happens? How do people treat you? They treat me very well, and I don't know how I go about it. Sometimes I even have to rent a hall and advertise. Sometimes I speak to the principal of the high school. But aren't the people scared of gypsies, vagabonds, and actors? I guess they are at first. At the beginning, they take me for a kind of harmless freak. But I'm honest, and I don't charge much, and after the little material takes over and gets into them. You see, I respect the material. That makes the difference. I'm not a charlatan, I'm an actor. Good or bad, I'm an actor. His color had deepened with whiskey and vehemence, and perhaps at being able to talk to someone with little likeness of experience. I poured more into his glass, and this time watched with pleasure his enjoyment of it. He drank and sighed. Don't get something like this very often, he said. I hope I haven't given you the impression that I'm rolling in receipts. Sometimes it's a little rough. Go on about it. Tell me more. Where was I? You were saying you respected your material, and that you were an actor. Oh yes. Well, there's one more thing. You know when the show people come into what they call the sticks, they have a contempt for the yokels? Well, it took me a little time, but when I learned that there aren't any yokels, I began to get on fine. I learned respect for my audience. Once they feel that they work with me and not against me, once you respect them, they can understand anything you tell them. Tell me about your material. What do you use? He looked down at his hands, and I saw they were well kept and very white, as though he wore gloves most of the time. I hope you don't think I'm stealing material, he said. I admire the delivery of the Sir John Jalud. I heard him do his monologue of Shakespeare, The Ages of Man, and then I bought a record of it to study, what he can do with words, with tones and inflections. You use that? Yes, but I don't steal it. I tell about hearing Sir John and what it did to me, and then I say I'm going to try to give an impression of how he did it. Clever. Well, it does help because it gives authority to the performance, and Shakespeare doesn't need billing, and that way I'm not stealing his material. It's like I'm celebrating him, which I do. How do they respond? Well, I guess I'm pretty much at home with it now, because I can watch the words sink in, and they forget about me, and their eyes kind of turn inward, and I'm not a freak to them anymore. Well, what do you think? I think Gilgood would be pleased. Oh, I wrote to him and told him what I was doing, and how I was doing it. A long letter. He brought a lumpy wallet from his hip pocket and extracted a carefully folded piece of aluminum foil, opened it, and with careful fingers unfolded a small sheet of notepaper with a name engraved at the top. The message was typed. It said, Dear ... Thank you for your kind and interesting letter. I would not be an actor if I were not aware of the sincere flattery implied in your work. Good luck and God bless you. John Gilgood. I sighed and watched his reverent fingers fold the note and close it in its armor of foil and put it away. I never show that to anyone to get a show, he said. I wouldn't think of doing that. And I'm sure he wouldn't. He whirled his plastic glass in his hands and regarded the rinse of whiskey left in it, a gesture often designed to draw emptiness to the attention of a host. I uncorked the bottle. No, he said, no more for me. I learned long ago that the most important and valuable of acting techniques is the exit. But I'd like to ask some more questions. All the more reason for the exit. He drained the last drop. Keep them asking, he said, and exit clean and sharp. Thank you and good afternoon. I watched him swing lightly toward his trailer, and I knew I would be haunted by one question. I called out, Wait a moment. He paused and turned back to me. What does the dog do? Oh, a couple of silly tricks, he said. He keeps the performance simple. He picks it up when it goes stale. And he continued on to his home. So it went on. Profession older than writing, and one that will probably survive when the written word has disappeared. And all the sterile wonders of movies and television and radio will fail to wipe it out. A living man in communication with a living audience. But how did he live? Who were his companions? What was his hidden life? He was right. His exit whetted the questions. The night was loaded with omens. The grieving sky turned the little water to a dangerous metal, and then the wind got up. Not the gusty, rabbity winds of the seacoasts, I know, but a great, busting sweep of wind with nothing to inhibit for 1,000 miles in any direction. Because it was a wind strange to me, and therefore mysterious, it set up mysterious responses in me. In terms of reason, it was strange only because I found it so. But a godly part of our experience, which we find inexplicable, must be like that. To my certain knowledge, many people conceal experiences for fear of ridicule. How many people have seen or heard or felt something which so outraged their sense of what should be that the whole thing was brushed quickly away, like dirt under a rug? For myself, I try to keep the line open for things I can't understand or explain, but it is difficult in this frightened time. At this moment in North Dakota, I had a reluctance to drive on that amounted to fear. At the same time, Charley wanted to go. In fact, made such a commotion about going that I tried to reason with him. Listen to me, dog. I have a strong impulse to stay, amounting to celestial command. If I should overcome it and go, and a great snow should close in on us, I would recognize it as a warning disregarded. If we stay, and a big snow should come, I would be certain I had a pipeline to prophecy. Charley sneezed and paced restlessly. All right, mon cœur, let's take your side of it. You want to go on. Suppose we do, and in the night a tree should crash down right where we are presently standing. It would be you who have the attention to the gods. And there is always that chance. I could tell you many stories about faithful animals who saved their masters, but I think you are just bored, and I am not going to flatter you. Charley leveled at me his most cynical eye. I think he is neither a romantic nor a mystic. I know what you mean. If we go, and no tree crashes down, or stay, and no snow falls, what then? I'll tell you what then. We forget the whole episode, and the field of prophecy is in no way injured. I vote to stay, you vote to go. But being nearer the pinnacle of creation than you, and also president, I cast the deciding vote. We stayed, and it didn't snow, and no tree fell, so naturally we forgot the whole thing, and we are wide open for more mystic feelings when they come. And in the early morning, swept clean of clouds and telesophically clear, we crunched around on the thick white ground covered in frost and got underway. The caravan of the arts was dark, but the dog barked as we ground up to the highway. Someone must have told me about the Missouri River at Bismarck, North Dakota, or I must have read about it. In either case, I hadn't paid attention. I came on it in amazement. Here is where the map should fold. Here is where the boundary between east and west. On the Bismarck side, it is eastern landscape, eastern grass, with the look and smell of eastern America. Across the Missouri on the Madden side, it is pure west, with brown grass and water scorns and small outcrops. The two sides of the river might well be 1,000 miles apart. But I was not prepared for the Missouri boundary, so I was not prepared for the Badlands. They deserve this name. They are like the work of an evil child. Such a place the fallen angels might have built as a spite to heaven, dry and sharp, desolate and dangerous, and for me filled with foreboding. A sense comes from it that does not like or welcome humans. But humans being what they are, and I being human, I turned off the highway on a shady road and headed in among the buttes, but with a shyness as though I crashed a party. The road surface tore viciously at my tires, and I made Rocinante's overloaded springs cry with anguish. What a place for a colony of troglodytes, or better, of trolls. And here's an odd thing. Just as I felt unwanted in this land, so do I feel reluctance in writing about it. Presently I saw a man leaning on a 2-strand barbed wire fence, the wires fixed not to the post but to the crooked tree limbs stuck in the ground. The man wore a dark hat and jeans and long jacket, washed pale as blue with lighter places at the knees and elbows. His pale eyes were frosted with sun glare and his lips scaly as snakeskin. A .22 rifle leaned against the fence beside him, and on the ground lay a little heap of fur and feathers, rabbits and small birds. I pulled up to speak to him, saw his eyes watch over Rocinante, sweep up the details, and then retire into their sockets, and I found I had nothing to say to him. The "looks like an early winter," or "any good fishing hereabouts," didn't seem to apply, and so we simply brewed at each other. "Afternoon." "Yes, sir," he said. "Any place nearby where I can buy some eggs?" Not real close by, unless you want to go as far as Galva or up to beach. I was set for some scratch hen eggs. Powdered, he said. My missus gets powdered. Lived here long? Yep. I waited for him to ask something, or to say something so we could go on, but he didn't. And as the silence continued, it became more and more impossible to think of something to say. I made one more try. Does it get very cold here in winters? Fairly. You talk too much. He grinned. That's what the missus says. So long, I said, and I put the car in gear and moved along. And in my rearview mirror, I couldn't see that he looked after me. He may not be a typical Badlander, but he was one of the few I caught. A little farther along, I stopped at a small house, a section of war surplus barracks, it looked, but painted white with yellow trim, and with the dying vestiges of a garden, frosted down geraniums, and a few clusters of chrysanthemums, little button things yellow and red-brown. I walked up the path with the certainty that I was being regarded from behind the white window curtains. An old woman answered my knock and gave me the drink of water I asked for and nearly talked my arm off. She was hungry to talk, frantic to talk, about her relatives, her friends, and how she wasn't used to this. For she was not a native, and she didn't rightly belong here. Her native clime was a land of milk and honey, and had its share of apes and ivory and peacocks. Her voice rattled on, as though she was terrified of the silence that would settle when I was gone. It came to me as she talked that she was afraid of this place, and further, that so was I. I felt I wouldn't like to have the night catch me here. I went into a state of flight, returning to get away from the unearthly landscape, and then the late afternoon changed everything. As the sun angled, the buttes and pools, the cliffs and sculptured hills and ravines lost their burned and dreadful look, and glowed with yellow and rich browns, and 100 variations of red and silver gray, all picked out by streaks of coal black. It was so beautiful that I stopped near a thicket of dwarfed and wind-warped cedars and junipers, and once stopped I was caught, trapped in color and dazed by the clarity of the light. Against the ascending sun and battlements were dark and gloom-lined, while to the east, where the uninhibited light poured slantwise, the strange landscape shouted with color. And the night, far from being frightful, was lovely beyond the thought, for the stars were close, and although there was no moon, the starlight made a silver glow in the sky. The air cut the nostrils with a dry frost, and for pure pleasure I collected a pile of dry dead cedar branches and built a small fire just to smell the perfume of the burning wood, and to hear the excited crackle of the branches. My fire made a dome of yellow light over me, and nearby I heard a screech owl hunting and barking of coyotes. Not howling, but the sort of chuckling bark of the dark of the moon. This is one of the few places I have ever seen where the night was friendlier than the day, and I can easily see how people are driven back to the Badlands. Before I slept, I spread a map of my bed, a Charley map. Beach was not far away, and that would mean the end of North Dakota. And coming up would be Montana, where I had never been. That night was so cold that I put on my insulated underwear for pajamas, and when Charley had done his duties and had biscuits and consumed his usual gallon of water and finally curled up in his place under the bed, I dug out an extra blanket and covered him, all except the tip of his nose. And he sighed and wriggled and gave a great groan of pure ecstatic comfort, and I thought how every safe generality I gathered in my travels was cancelled by another. In the night, the Badlands had become the Goodlands. I can't explain it. That's how it was. The next passage in my journey is a love affair. I am in love with Montana. For other states I have had admiration, respect, recognition, even some affection. But with Montana it is love, and it's difficult to analyze love when you're in it. Once, when I raptured in a violet glow given off by the queen of the world, my father asked me why, and I thought he was crazy not to see. Of course, I know now that she was a mouse-haired, freckle-nosed, scabby-kneed little girl with a voice like a bat and the loving kindness of a Gila monster, but she lightened up the landscape and me. It seems to me that Montana is a great splash of grandeur. The scale is huge but not overpowering. The land is rich with grass and color, and the mountains are the kind I would create if mountains were ever put on my agenda. Montana seems to me what a small boy would think Texas is like from hearing Texans. Here for the first time, I heard a definite regional accent unaffected by TV, a slow-paced, warm speech. It seemed to me that the frantic bustle of America was not in Montana. Its people did not seem afraid of shadows in a John Birch Society sense. The calm of the mountains and the rolling grasslands had got into the inhabitants. It was hunting season when I drove through the state. The men I talked to seemed to me not moved by a riot of seasonal slaughter, but simply to be going out to kill edible meat. Again, my attitude may be informed by love, but it seemed to me that the towns were places to live in rather than nervous hives. People had time to pause in their occupations to undertake the passing art of neighborliness. I found I did not rush through the towns to get them over with. I even found things I had to buy to make myself linger. In Billings, I bought a hat. In Livingston, a jacket. In Butte, a rifle. I didn't particularly need a Remington bolt action secondhand, but in the beautiful condition. Then I found a telescope sight that I had to have, and waited while it was mounted on the rifle, and in the process got to know everyone in the shop and any customers who entered. With the gun in a vise and the bolt out, we zeroed the new sight on a chimney 3 blocks away, and later when I got to shooting the little gun, I found no reason to change it. I spent a good part of a morning at this, mostly because I wanted to stay. But I see that, as usual, love is inarticulate. Montana has a spell on me. It is a grandeur and warmth. If Montana had a seacoast, or if I could live away from the sea, I would instantly move there and petition for admission. Of all states, it is my favorite and my love. At Custer, we made a side trip south to pay our respects to General Custer and Sitting Bull on the battlefield of Little Bighorn. I don't suppose there's an American who doesn't carry Remington's painting of the last offense of the center column of the 7th Cavalry in his head. I removed my hat in memory of the brave men, and Charley saluted in his own manner, but I thought with great respect. The whole of eastern Montana and western Dakotas is memory marked as Indian country, and the memories are not very old either. Some years ago, my neighbor was Charles Erskine Scott Wood, who wrote Heavenly Discourse. He was a very old man when I knew him, but as a young lieutenant just out of the military academy, he had been assigned to General Miles, and he served in the Chief Joseph campaign. His memory of it was very clear and very sad. He said that one of the most gallant retreats in all history. Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce, with squaws and children, dogs, and all their possessions, retreated under heavy fire for over 1,000 miles, trying to escape to Canada. Wood said they fought every step of the way, against odds, until finally they were surrounded by the cavalry, under General Miles, and a large part of them wiped out. It was the saddest duty he had ever performed, Wood said, and he had never lost his respect for the fighting qualities of the Nez Perces. If they hadn't had their families with them, we could have never caught them, he said, and if we had been evenly matched in men and weapons, we couldn't have beaten them. They were men, he said, real men. I must confess to a laxness in the matter of national parks. I haven't visited many of them. Perhaps this is because they enclose the unique, spectacular, the astounding, the greatest waterfall, the deepest canyon, the highest cliff, the most stupendous works of man or nature. And I would rather see a good Brady photograph than Mount Rushmore, for it is my opinion that we enclose and celebrate the freaks of our nation and our civilization. Yellowstone National Park is no more representative of America than is Disneyland. This being my natural attitude, I don't know what made me turn sharply south and cross the state line to take a look at Yellowstone. Perhaps it was a fear of my neighbors. I could hear them say, "You mean you were that near to Yellowstone and you didn't go? You must be crazy." Again, it might have been the American tendency to travel. One goes, not so much to see, but to tell afterward. Whatever my purpose in going to Yellowstone, I'm glad I went because I discovered something about Charley I might have never known. A pleasant-looking national park man checked me in, and then he said, "How about that dog? They aren't permitted except on leash." "Why?" I asked. "Because of the bears." "Sir," I said, "this is a unique dog. He does not live by tooth or fang. He respects the right of cats to be cats, although he doesn't admire them. He turns his step rather than disturb an earnest caterpillar. His greatest fear is that someone will point out a rabbit and suggest that he chase it. This is a dog of peace and tranquility. I suggest that the greatest danger to your bears will be pique at being ignored by Charley." The young man laughed. "I wasn't so much worried about the bears," he said, "but our bears have developed an intolerance for dogs. One of them might demonstrate his prejudice with a clip on the chin, and then no dog." "I'll lock him in the back, sir." I promise you Charley will cause no ripple in the bear world, and as an old bear looker, neither will I. I just have to warn you, he said. I have no doubt your dog has the best of intentions. On the other hand, our bears have the worst. Don't leave food about. Not only do they steal, but they are critical of anyone who tries to reform them. In a word, don't believe their sweet faces or you might get clobbered. And don't let the dog wander. Bears don't argue. We went on our way into the wonderland of nature gone nuts, and you will have to believe what happened. The only way I can prove it would be to get a bear. Less than a mile from the entrance, I saw a bear beside the road, and it ambled out as though to flag me down. Instantly, a change came over Charley. He shrieked with rage. His lips flared, showing wicked teeth that had some troubling with a dog biscuit. He screeched insults at the bear, which hearing, the bear reared up and seemed to me to overtop Rocinante. Frantically, I rolled the windows shut, and swinging quickly to the left, grazed the animal, then scuttled on while Charley raved and ranted beside me, describing in detail what he would do to that bear if he could get at him. I was never so astonished in my life. To the best of my knowledge, Charley had never seen a bear, and in his whole history he had showed great tolerance for every living thing. Besides all this, Charley is a coward, so deep-seated a coward that he has developed a technique for concealing it, and yet he showed every evidence of wanting to get out and murder a bear that outweighed him 1,000 to 1. I don't understand it. A little further along, 2 bears showed up, and the effect was doubled. Charley became a maniac. He leaped all over me, he cursed and growled, snarled and screamed. I didn't know he had the ability to snarl. Where did he learn it? Bears were in good supply, and the road became a nightmare. For the first time in his life, Charley resisted reason, even resisted a cuff on the ear. He became a primitive killer, lusting for the blood of his enemy, and up to this moment he had had no enemies. In a bearless stretch, I opened the cab, took Charley by the collar, and locked him in the house. But that did no good. When he passed other bears, he leaped on the table and scratched at the windows trying to get out at them. I could hear canned goods crashing as he struggled in his mania. Bears simply brought out the hide in my Jekyll-headed dog. But what could have caused it? Was it a pre-breed memory of a time when the wolf was in him? I know him well. Once in a while he tries a bluff, but it's a palpable lie. I swear this was no lie. I am certain that if he was released he would have charged every bear we passed and found victory or death. It was too nerve-wracking, a shocking spectacle, like seeing an old, calm friend go insane. No amount of natural wonders, of rigid cliffs and boasting waters, of smoking springs, could even engage my attention while that pandemonium went on. After about the 5th encounter, I gave up, turned Rocinante about, and retraced my way. If I had stopped the night and bears had gathered to my cooking, I dare not think what would have happened. At the gate, the park guard checked me out. You didn't stay long. Where's the dog? Locked up back there, and I owe you an apology. That dog has the heart and soul of a bear killer, and I didn't know it. Heretofore, he has been a little tender-hearted toward an underdone steak. Yeah, he said. That happens sometimes. That's why I warned you. A bear dog would know his chances, but I've seen a Pomeranian go up like a puff of smoke. You know, a well-favored bear can bat a dog like a tennis ball. I moved fast, back the way I had come, and I was reluctant to camp for fear there might be some unofficial non-government bears about. That night, I spent in a pretty auto court near Livingston. I had my dinner in a restaurant, and when I had settled in with a drink and a comfortable chair and my bathed feet on carpet with red roses, I inspected Charley. He was dazed. His eyes held a faraway look, and he was totally exhausted, emotionally, no doubt. Mostly he reminded me of a man coming out of a long, hard drunk, worn out, depleted, collapsed. He couldn't eat his dinner, he refused the evening walk, and once we were in, he collapsed on the floor and went to sleep. In the night, I heard him whining and yapping, and when I turned on the light, his feet were making running gestures, and his body jerked, and his eyes were wide open, but it was only a night bear. I awakened him and gave him some water. This time he went to sleep and didn't stir all night. In the morning, he was still tired. I wonder why we think the thoughts and emotions of animals are simple. That is the end of part 5. Next is part 6, which is relatively small, I believe, and then that will mark the end of part 3, and then we'll only have one more part after that. I hope that you enjoyed this reading, and I hope to get the next to you very soon. thank you so much, as always, for watching and listening and supporting the channel. And I hope you have a good day, night, whatever it is, wherever you are.